uh, I will gladly do so. Basically, let me talk about the concept of those conversations we're going to have. The idea came up from a conversation I had with Niall a couple of months ago, and we have decided that given the fact that managers are at the crossroads of every activity in the music industry, it would be nice to have a series of interviews and conversation, more like friendly conversation rather than interviews with all the stakeholders in the music industry. The music industry has been really seriously disrupted those past years, and we are actually facing a total change of paradigm with the inception of streaming, the streaming economy, the changes due to the actual sanitary crisis, and I know that Danton mentioned it earlier, and all those changes have deeply affected the music production structures and the music production value change. But a little has been said about the changes it generated for the music production as a whole and for music producers in particular. It was interesting for me to have this conversation with Danton because Danton has a career that spans over quite some time and is a very experienced and record producer. But before we go into more detail, I think the best is to get Danton to introduce himself to you. So please, Danton.
I am Danton Supple. I am a record producer. I was formerly an engineer, recording engineer. I still do that. I've now been doing this for 35 years. I started off always based in London studios, but I've moved around over the years. Worked with a number of artists in the capacity of an engineer or a producer. The last 15, 20 years has mainly been in production. And I have studios in London. This place at Strong Room Studios, which is a group of studios in East London, which has been here for about 30 years, 35 years, about the same time I've been doing this, and a studio in West London near Portobello.
Basically, the whole idea of this conversation, Danton, is to go over the changes that the job of music producers has been going through over the past 10 to 20 years. In your opinion, roughly, and then we go into details as we move along and as we get questions from the people who are attending. Can you a little bit tell you what, in your mind, in your opinion, have been the most important changes over the past 20 to 25 years in terms of technique, in terms of mentality, culture, budgets, relationships, I mean, the whole lot, basically?
I mean, in the entire time of my career, 35 years, there's been a huge change in what we expect from the title of producer. Producers, when I started in the industry, could be quite easily broken into two parts. There were musician producers and engineering producers, people who came through the studio recording engineering path and went into production. You normally have a musical background of sorts, but or those who didn't come from a technical background, but purely a musical background. That was also more possible because studios and the whole industry, when we had a bigger budget, in a session, you would have a producer, you would have an engineer, you may have a programmer, you'd have an assistant, and you'd have a runner. You'd have these 5 people running around doing different things. The change more than anything has been budget driven and technology driven, because also in those days, you had to better drive a desk. You weren't using your laptop. So you had to have an engineer who had the experience to record, use desks, microphones, and was familiar with studios. As the technologies move forward now, so that everyone has the same capacity to record something now through their laptops using all the various DAWs we now have, the skill set of engineering became less important. And also there was another extra person to this group was songwriters, who might have been people who you had the songwriter who gave a demo in a basic form to producers and engineers who then took it further. What the tech has now enabled is that the songwriter has moved into the production world because the demos they're producing are of such high standard. We're all using the same equipment. You go back 25 years, songwriters didn't have a Neve desk or an SSL desk in their home, whereas now our interface for recording music is the same for everybody. It's a level playing field. So as the budgets dropped, being a producer who could engineer helped, because you kind of got the record companies and the artists got two for the price of one. So I think having the luxury of a different person as an engineer and the producer is one of the big changes for me, because they both have a lot of work in their own rights. And so having to do both, some of the bigger albums I've done in the past, where you are the producer and the engineer in a traditional studio environment with desks, is hard work. There's a lot to think about. You're thinking of the mechanics of the session, the tech of the session, but also you're thinking of the song, the artist interaction, the liaisons between players, and it's quite tough, and this merging of the two paths. But it is very much expected now. I still use engineers because it makes my life easier, even though I still like to step in and engineer. But I think one of the biggest changes is the balancing up of the sort of playing field of opportunity. That now, I don't really have any more sitting here in an expensive London studio, once you take out the hardware and most of the work is done on the laptop, than a 16-year-old in his bedroom. We have the same plugins, the same mic amps, the same DAW. We might spend or have a different budgets for microphones, but apart from that, it's fairly balanced. And so trying to define your position as a producer is harder. I mean, I don't think that's a bad thing. I think everyone has to, it's a meritocracy. You have to prove your value to a session as a producer, but that's a lot more competitive now than it was maybe 25, 30 years ago. But I think it's now the fact that it's a much more all-encompassing job. You're doing the engineering, the technical side, the mixing. You have to have an understanding of the tech within DAWs as a producer nowadays. And record companies would also expect you to have a place to record. There was a period of time where I knew very few producers who had studios. When you signed an artist or when you got money for a budget for a project, part of your skill set as a producer was deciding the appropriate studio to go to record that artist, and to go to the right studio for the sound that you wanted. Whereas now, not only do labels expect producers to have a studio space.
Danton, I'm sorry. I'm going to interrupt you, Danton. 1 second. There is a noise in the background that is a little bit disturbing. So I don't know where this is coming from. I don't know if it's.
Is it a click or a noise?
It is like a click. Yes.
I might just pull you off into an internal mic. So just hang on 1 second whilst I quickly jump.
Yes, please.
It happens every time you speak.
Yeah. And that doesn't happen in everyday life, so I think it is some kind of fault.
When you speak.
You have a new edge. It's thanks.
Thank you. Just 1 second. Let me just quickly go to 1 sec. Yeah, that could become annoying over a period of time. I should hope you know how microphones work.
Digital noise.
Yeah. Okay, I'm now on a built-in microphone. Is that better?
Yes, I think so. Yes,
Excellent.
It is.
Much better.
A little more distant.
Much better.
Yeah. There's me talking about the tech and 35 years of knowledge, and then give you broken microphone. So hopefully you can still hear me. So where was I?
Talking about balancing of the fact that basically that very few record producers at the time, way back then,
had studios,
recording studios.
That was also partly due to the fact to have a recording studio, you needed a desk, and they were phenomenally expensive at the time. So now most people can afford. I mean, and then to get an idea of the depreciation of desks and what they used to cost, this desk here, when it was first bought, was £250,000, £250,000, and I bought it for just over £2,000. So not only is there the technology changed, the prices have changed significantly, but most people nowadays can buy a pretty comprehensive studio suite of microphone amps, a few bits of gear, a decent DAW, for a few £1,000s. So, that's one of the big changes, I think, is that there wasn't this sort of hierarchy of just being fortunate to be in the right places. Also, there was a limited number of studios, which meant there was a limited amount of recording, or a finite amount of recording going on. And the other thing is that everything that was being recorded to go out for general consumption was signed to a record label. I mean, that was the only way you end up getting into studios. You were signed to a record label. The position of the record label is also diminished in the same way as that of recording studios. And in fact, nowadays, a lot of the clients I work with have chosen not to maybe sign to a record label because the opportunities outside of that sphere are immense and widespread.
We are going to talk about this later. Going back to what you said and having basically two major areas of changes, which are funding and technology. Come to think about it, the way to create is, it seems to me, has drastically changed as well. I remember days when basically bands used to write in recording studios, and the recording process lasted for months. When now I have the feeling that the creation happens mostly outside the studio, or at least outside your studio, and more likely in home studios. And basically the whole idea at some point, and probably be it for financial or economical reasons, but is to shorten the production period, and it's to use what, say, in terms of production, mixing, sometimes even mastering, it's 3 days per track. I mean, it used to be maybe a month per track 20 or 30 years ago.
The whole structure now, and this isn't a complaint. There's a lot of these changes we're talking about where I actually, I like the way we've been forced into a slightly more competitive and a thoughtful process with regards to budget. Back in the days when budgets were huge, albums could be 5-6 months long. You'd go into a great studio and you'd be there for the entire project. People would be writing in the studio, you'd be recording, and you'd just be sat down. And even in those days, I kept thinking, there's a lot of money being wasted. There's a lot of bands who weren't signed to labels who could have had the opportunity had we had a slightly more fair distribution of those budgets. So one thing that has changed from that idea of you start a record with a huge budget, you go into a studio and you just immerse yourself for 6 months, is it has to be far more structured. And again, that comes under the remit of the producer now. So for instance, the writing would have been done before, absolutely, and you decided on songs. And for me, when I have whatever the budget is, I now have to think about which studio I need to be in or which area for every point of the recording. So there'll be pre-production in a rehearsal room. I then have to be in a studio of some sorts for drums, live drums, for instance. But after they're cut, I don't really need to be in those kind of spaces. So then you would move to somewhere less expensive or more appropriate to the next overdubs you're doing. As I say, they expect producers to have a studio. So more often than not, you'll end up in your own studio quite soon afterwards. But you have to schedule and book the right places for the budget now, going through a project, and think out about what you need. Also, with hire gear, we'd hire drum kits, we'd hire keyboards, we'd hire synths and guitars, and they just sit there in the studio throughout the entire project, which at the time I still thought was a waste. But this was an era of the music industry being very flush. So now, I sequence it that, okay, if I need to particular keyboards in, that will be scheduled that we're doing those on those days, and then we'll be doing that whilst they're hired, and then moving on. So it's slightly less exciting and less of a flow, and there's more to think about. But I think it's good to be a bit more focused like that.
On average, nowadays, yeah. At what stage are you brought in?
It depends. The other thing is, because we're all working on these formats nowadays, you're writing your demos on the same format I'm using in the studio. And so just to explain where I come into the procedure, a lot of what is recorded in a demo or writing session, when the artist is first writing the song, is now usable through to the end of the record. They're not doing it on a 4-track cassette machine like they would have been 20 years ago. They're doing it on a digital format Pro Tools session. And there's a lot of the times where I start a record where I'm listening to the demo, and there's fundamental bits of the writing or the demo, which I think, why would we do this again? The artist has clearly spent time in a relaxed atmosphere at home or their studio, doing a part which for me to recreate within the short period of time I might have within the studio budget would be pointless. And so even if it's not a perfect sound or a perfect part, we can still edit it and take it forward. So it might mean now that I join later on than I would have done beforehand, where I had to record everything on the project. But we still join, try and join early on in song selection. If I'm doing an album of 12 songs, I don't really want to be given 12 songs. I'd rather have 16 songs where we choose our best 12, or we maybe record 14 and then see how they pan out over a record. You can sometimes start a record thinking you know what the 12 are, and then you have a couple of days of just some special overdubs happen, or there's moments where a song suddenly jumps up in its position. And so I'd like to record more than we actually require for the album. But I like to get in that early, so I'm actually helping with song decisions before we get into a project.
That's the next point I wanted to get into. Basically, my feeling is that the nature of the producer's work, of his job, has drastically changed over the past 20 or 30 years. I see lots of producers becoming co-writes, being involved in writing and composing. I mean, getting songs that are even not completely finished. Sometimes you have just a chorus. Some you have just like a few lines. It's just a vague melody, something that still needs to be structured. I think that did not necessarily exist years ago, which makes it I'm working with lots of producers who do now have their own publishing structure, and publishing is turning now into a serious a source of income for any given producer, which probably was.
Well, this goes back to what you were saying about who are producers. The songwriter who's now has the equipment to be able to record is now stepping beyond their old position. They're now becoming the producer as well, because they've done a lot of the work. So they might have beforehand handed that on to a music producer, whereas now they are the producer. So although it's not so much as the producer becoming the songwriter as well as being a producer, it's the songwriter becoming a producer as well as a songwriter.
Right, okay. No, I never saw it under that angle, but
I see it more that way. So a lot of the projects I do now, it might be doing additional production and mixing, because the original songwriter with the artist is now taking the production a lot further down the road. So you might be able to just add a few things at the end. You might be doing vocals rather than the whole project. With regards to being part of that, it separates things from me. One of the aspects of being a producer on a project is being the person outside of that equation who can have an objective view of what's going on. You're not being drawn by being the songwriter, where you're being pulled a certain way by having your part of the song there. You are this person outside of the equation who has a separate view on what's going on. So you're not making decisions based on, it's just, is it good? Is it working? Is it not working? I'm not concerned as to who wrote that bit or who didn't write that bit, because obviously if you've written a bit and you get more into a production, you're getting more royalties. So you're being driven by maybe a more financial decision. I do things where I am part of the writing. Some of those I would see more as being.
Oops. I don't know if it's me or if we have a little issue here.
I think that's coming from Danton's side.
Yeah.
I'd imagine. Yeah.
Danton's internet.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, it's going to come back in a second.
Let's give him a sec.
We will. I'm taking advantage of this little break. I mean, it's a friendly conversation, so don't hesitate to pop in, barge in and, ask questions.
Yeah, there he is.
He's coming back in. We lost you for a second, Danton. Sorry.
I saw. I'm not sure why. The studio has incredibly quick internet, but there is a van outside actually with one of the internet companies written on the side of it. So hopefully that's nothing to do with it. So where was I at? Oh, about writing. To me, if I'm part of the writing process, it's less easy to be that sort of subjective, maybe, with the overall picture. And also with when I'm working with a band, you are that person who's not part of the band. So again, it's easier for you to make decisions quite often and have an overview on the project. A different way of looking at it is that sometimes I might have part of the publishing purely as a means of being paid. If you went back 15 years and you said, as a producer, to produce a project, you wanted a bit of the publishing, people would have been horrified. Whereas now that's very much understood that it's the only way forward. We used to be paid with mechanical royalties as a producer, but no one sells anything physical anymore. So you can't really justify the work for that kind of deal. So often now, the percentage you would have had as a mechanical royalty as a producer would now be you'd have it as part of the publishing, 4%, 5%, maybe more depending on the deal you're doing. These things are all on sliding scales nowadays. So an artist might be paying this amount of money, and you have, say, a couple of points of publishing money, or they might have no money, but you really want to do the project, and then they understand they need to give a bit more. I like that because it's more of a meritocracy in the sense that if it does well, you will do well and no one's that concerned. And if it does less successfully than you imagine, then it works better for both as well. It's more equal, more equitable that way. Because in the old days, producers got paid big fees for projects. And so you got that fee no matter what. And I always preferred more royalties-based deals because it felt like you're more part of the team. If you do well, you all do well. And it did feel more meritocratic that way.
That raises for me two sets of questions. The first about the decision-making process and the creation process. I have the feeling that now, even upstream of any creation, you start to include or to think marketing strategies and include a sort of a marketing gimmicks into the creation. Are you sometimes included in that process to go way more upstream today than it used to be 20 years ago? And then I would like to talk about funding and payments and money and sharing the value, if you don't mind. But
I do think that shifts around depending on the genre you're working on. If you're working on pure pop music, chart music, Radio 1 here, for instance, it fits a fairly narrow bandwidth of styles. And if that's where they're aiming for, you'll be producing specifically for that. I prefer the freedom of not being in that world where you're producing a song for the merit of the song. You're doing the production style for what you think is the best way of conveying the message of that particular song. You're not thinking about what radio station you need to fit into. What is the market for that particular, you're listening to the song thinking this song would best be conveyed in this manner, and you can kind of produce accordingly. You also have to think about the identity of the band. You can't go off at a tangent and suddenly do something that doesn't fit who they are or who their fans expect to be. But I find it's dangerous territory, and I've seen it happen a lot, where an artist is signed because everyone loves the artist in a certain way, and then once within the label tries to repackage it and market it to fit a particular radio outlet. And there's no honesty to that. And therefore, and to me, if you're not doing things with a truly honest streak through it, you're never going to take them to their full potential. It's very confusing. You tend to lose the original fans you had outside before, when they got signed, and you don't necessarily gain the fans when you try and restructure it because it's not a real thing. And if you look at the artists who are huge, nearly all of them are at the front of something different. Very few of them were ever fitting into something else. And it's just been something that goes on forever. When you have a huge artist, labels will then instantly start signing similar or copycat acts. And that's a far less exciting place to be, because those people you will be producing to fit that previous model. The previous model that became a huge artist, the reason they were huge is because they were different and they were new, and you'd been free to produce something that felt valued for the track. So
I remember the days when Nirvana was successful. I mean, we released probably 25 grunge albums per label, and just to try to be, it was being followers, right, and not trendsetters.
Absolutely, but also it was much easier to be eclectic then and diverse. I was watching one of the top British TV programs for music, an episode from 1978, and the thing that stood out, I was watching it with a friend, was how every act was completely different. The genres, they're all in the top 20 of the charts. That's how they got onto the program. but completely different range of artists and different styles of music. They were just making music, and that music found an audience that loved it and purchased it. If you listen to the top 20 nowadays, okay, there are exceptions and there's variation, but you can quite often get a sequence of songs, different artists, all on Radio 1, where if you were to edit between them, it wouldn't sound that weird as a song. You know, there's a similarity to, it's become a much more narrow bandwidth of style within that top radio bracket. Which is why
I'm afraid radio formatting was a catastrophe.
Yeah, it's still going on.
And still is, in my opinion.
I do have this belief still that if we make a song where everyone in the room believes it's a great song and we've done a production which we feel fits with that song, then there will be a percentage of people out there that feel the same way. I think when you try and aim for something which isn't necessarily where the song is, you're second guessing yourself, and it's never going to be as successful.
Talking about, I mean, this again, you know, I'm going back and forth between the various issues that you have raised. In my opinion, one very interesting thing is slightly changed subject, and it's about A&Ring. What is your view? I hate the word judgment, but what's your view on the evolution of A&Ring? Because it's
that's completely different
what you're doing, and basically knowing that we are now into what I call a data economy and the dictatorship of data in terms of A&Ring, you know, as opposed to 20 or 30 years ago when the Bob Dylans of this world in the early 60s got signed, and the Beatles, etc., etc. And A&Ring today, where basically if you don't have 2 million viewers on YouTube, you don't get signed. And it seems like the question of the music genre and the talent comes second, you know, as opposed to a kind of a market that you're bringing because you're visible on social media. So what do you think? How do you think this evolution of A&Ring, how does it affect your work? And
it affects it a great deal, but I think the main group that it affects are the artists. I think you have far more freedom as an artist now. If you go back to the era where labels were paying for everything and everything we did in studios was being run by a label, you naturally had an A&R man that came with that project. And they varied greatly in their skill sets. I mean, I've worked with A&R people who are just fantastic, and the project worked because of, you know, the relationship with them and their direction for an artist. And others who really didn't make it easy and didn't have what I thought was the right vision or a shared vision for the artist. And that wasn't great. I think I've worked with an A&R man maybe twice in the last 5 years. And what that does change, again, this is why artists aren't always aiming to be signed by a label. It's because your creative freedom is so much better. Now, what tends to happen now is the artist and I will make the record the artist wants to make and that we're all happy with. And then you'll present that to a label, should you want to go with a label. They're not taking they haven't got the risk factor anymore. The reason, you know, I understand their fears. They were investing in something, a lot of money, because it cost a lot of money to make a record. And the A&R man had to have some control to try and keep track of what was going on. That's also why the deals were so bad, I think, is because, you know, there was an element of a risk. Whereas now we basically present a finished record to the label. And so they can either like it or not like it, take it or not take it. So because they're taking the risk out of it and they're not doing that initial investment, the deal should have changed accordingly, and they didn't. You know, they're still not that favorable, I think, for artists. But I think the main thing has been freedom to make the record the artist and myself want to make without the constraints of the label.
Danton, can I pose a question there just on that? When you talk about kind of the lack of A&Ring and the creative freedom could be possibly too big, that there seems to be a kind of a sense of a loss of quality control. Would you go along with that?
Absolutely. I mean, yeah, there's a huge amount of noise, you might call it, out there. There's literally anyone who wants to make a record can put it up there. Where I think the A&R, the equivalent of A&R now is almost the curating of what's up there. So whereas you'd have had the A&R at the beginning to say who got signed, you're now looking for maybe playlists where you trust whoever's putting that together, and they're curating a world of music, you kind of know roughly where it's going to be, or a standard, even it might be quite wide in its genres. And that was the A&R man from beforehand. They had a good musical knowledge. They kind of knew what was technically good, and they could put things together for the label. There is the downside that, yeah, it's a free for all, so anyone can make music. But I think I would rather have that, and then we can self-choose what we want to hear, than have it dictated that the only things we get to hear have been chosen by this limited group. So, yeah, the downside is you have to wade through a lot of music nowadays to find things sometimes of quality. They still stand out. You know, the songs which are successful, they will jump to the top because they have all the ingredients to be a successful song, and they would have been signed probably in the past by an A&R man. This isn't being totally disparaging about A&R, but I can understand why the artist now feels that, you know, it is easier to make the record they want to make, which, you know, might not have fitted into everything that Didier was saying about the commercial future thoughts of the label, you know, where they imagined it going. And I think, you know, if you look at a lot of the great artists out there at the moment, we wouldn't necessarily have had them had they gone through the traditional route. They might not have been signed because they didn't fit in or tick all the boxes an A&R department would have required. So, I mean, there's swings and roundabouts here. There are indeed there's a lot of stuff out there. I mean, companies are becoming a bit more selective now. Companies which were open to almost anyone to sign up to and upload their digital, they were to put them on the various digital platforms, are being more selective. I think they realize that, you know, they have to be in a certain way, because even though it's just pop it up and it's fairly automated, that they become a bit heavy with unnecessary baggage almost, and it doesn't become cost effective for them even as platforms.
Thanks for that. I'm actually, there's another question, Didier, if you don't mind me interjecting there, from Juliet. Juliet, you posted a question there on the chat about the kind of spontaneity of one-man productions.
And before that, basically remind, and we had this conversation a couple of days ago with a few friends sitting here around the table. 2 years ago, Daniel Ek stated that 40,000 new tracks are uploaded every day on Spotify. Last week, in another interview, he stated it was now 60,000. So we're talking an increase of 50% within the past 2 or 3 years, which is absolutely amazing. And there's lots of very, very good stuff in there. So there's lots of production, and in my opinion, it's going to grow. And I would not be surprised if in a couple of years' time we have up to a million new tracks per day. Once Africa and South America and China and India will start producing, it's going to be massive. Would you consider A&Ring and production is still a differentiation factor and can make a record really successful? That would be number one. Number two, what we are witnessing now is that lots of these are based on songs.
Oh, sorry, Didier, I've lost you there.
Didier is lost in time. I'll just take this opportunity while Didier is going to refresh there. Juliet, you had a question. Oh no, yeah. He's back. Didier.
Yes, I'm sorry. Basically, there are new production ways today. You can also release a track every 2 months and be on an ongoing recording process, and not record 12 or 14 or 15 or 16 songs. What do you think about that?
Well, I think you hear that in records nowadays. The concept of the album first started to change with the onset of Apple Music way back when shuffle play came into action as a function you could have on your iPod. Until that point, we were making albums as albums. When I made a record, we thought about the identity of the record. The song sequence was very important. You know, when you finish recording your 10, 11 songs on a record, you really sit back and think about what was the running order for those songs? How do they flow into each other? What was the experience? One of the things that's changed greatly is the attention span of listeners. The idea of sitting back and listening to a whole album is a very small percentage of the listening public now who will do that. And also shuffle play meant that your planning of the running order of an album went out the window. One producer used to tended to make a record with an engineer. So he also had a kind of sonic identity that ran through a record. Whereas now, if you look at a lot of the chart albums, pop acts, you'll have 12 songs on a record. There'll be 12 different producers, 15 different writers, and 25 different engineers. And so in lots of ways, it can often sound like a best of, a greatest hits record than a cohesive album. So I think with regards to creating a piece of art, which is your music and you want to stand behind as an artist, I think a producer has to be able to bring a value which is maybe is helping you giving yourself a rounded identity as an artist for the music on that record. You also have to be able to convince people that they'll make a better record with you. I think one of the things about production is just pushing people that bit further. I know I'm guilty when I'm just doing my own things, maybe, of thinking, yeah, that's that works. Whereas as a producer saying, actually, no, you can do that a bit better. Or, how about you take those 2 bits you just did and put it into here? Or maybe that bit you put on the first chorus will be better than the second. So it's someone overseeing and constantly pushing you along to try and push your performance and, at the end, the music to a higher level. So I think you have to, definitely bring that as a producer. I think if you can't justify that you're going to make it an easier process, a better process, and a better outcome, then there's no reason why the artist should use you as a producer. I think it also makes it a much more enjoyable process. As I said, especially if there's multiple people in a band, the argument time can be, it's not very productive a lot of the time. It can be creative, disagreements, shall we say. But having someone who's like a bit of an arbitrator from outside the band setup, which is another big aspect of production, to say, actually, no, I tell you what, on this occasion I agree with you, or agree with you. I think actually if we combine these 2 ideas in this way. So, I mean, your position as a producer to help in that way can be, is valuable in itself. I say to people, what do you think you bring to a record? Why is a producer necessary nowadays? And these are the kind of things that are listed. It's just like, as the artist, I was just thinking about performing and doing my best. I wasn't having to think of all the other baggage that go around making a record, which is my job outside of just the artistic part. So you help people just focus, I think, and then just, as I say, help steer them through that route of making the record.
I have a question coming from Anna. And Anna's asking if given the current situation of the industry, the speed and the amount of music produced, do you think that genre classification will narrow or dilute?
I think generally the genre classification is getting wider and wider because everyone has an opportunity to put stuff up. So you can find literally everything up there. I think the genre breadth of successful pop music or radio music is getting thinner and thinner. I think there's this kind of spike of what is commercially successful music at the moment, which, if it's not your primary enjoyment, isn't a great thing. What I do like is the fact that you can find the most bizarre and incredible and interesting music if you search around now, because it's there to be put up. And this has come up in conversation recently about, with regards to record companies and things I was involved in outside of production, is about, something, it's not very good music. And I think one of the things I've never really liked is the fact that people think that we're there to be the arbiters of what is good. What I thought was good at 16, my dad would have hated, or I might even hate now. I think, it's in the eye of the beholder as to what is good. And one of the great things about the industry at the moment, is you'll find something you really love, but it's not for somebody else. What we don't have now, going back almost to our A&R conversation, is someone dictating what we get to hear because of what they deem to be good as such. So I think the breadth of genres is immensely wide now. And I personally think that's a good thing. I listen to a lot of different things, and there's music I hear, which is just, it's insane. Its productions are, they're crazy. They wouldn't ever be on commercial radio or TV, but I'm very glad the world has them out there. There's some, there's some great left field artists out there. So I don't think that's a problem. The numbers coming up, it gets harder to be heard. But then I think 2 things. One, hopefully production will help you take it a bit yourself higher, or at least make the best records you can make, which brings you up a tag or 2. I think then the curation within these platforms of playlists where people start to identify with decent curators would also pull you out of that mist. So I mean, there will be methods to come out of that. I mean, those numbers are extraordinary, Didier, when you're saying about 70,000 records a day. I mean, as soon as it gets to the point where there's more than you could ever possibly listen to, it's already quite sad. You already feel like you're missing out. It's this paradox of choice, isn't it? You have so much out there.
Some pretend that it's an abundance economy and that the abundance and that the amount is something profitable to creation, which I think is debatable.
I don't think it is, but if you think about it, there's only ever the same amount of money to spend. There's a finite number of people with a finite amount of cash. So by just, thinking about what we're saying here, there's going to be less money for any individual. You're still going to get the few who, but I don't think you're going to get the artists who make the money that they were making maybe 20 years ago. Maybe also because no one's paying £15 for a CD, where now it's a stream for a micro penny. So you're never really going to get the same financial returns.
Well, it's also a bit of a conversation we had a couple of days ago, and that is about the perceived value of music today. And we came to the conclusion that to a certain extent it became a commodity, and it's no longer branding somebody. I mean, which
I think that started to change quite a while back when. This goes right back to magazines having free versions of songs as part of, a plastic 7-inch stuck on the front. As soon as music started to be given away in any manner, it started to diminish the value or the perceived value of it. And as soon as we got to the first round of streaming, when it first came out, or even with not streaming, but just buying stuff on, with sharing in the days when it was illegal and people were sharing stuff. I was aware with my own daughters, at that age, back in their teens, their concept of the value of music, the idea of buying music. I was saying to them that as part of sort of pocket money, they could have a certain amount towards their iTunes to be able to buy songs, and they looked gobsmacked. Why would I buy stuff? And it's like I felt like saying to them, because the reason you live in the lifestyle you have is because people used to buy music. Funny enough, your dad, that's what he does for a living. That's my wares that I'm selling. But I was very aware then that the concept of a value for listening to music, rather than it being something that was there like gas and electricity, where you just turned it on and you could hear something for some kind of nominal cost, had already started to change. And that was 15 years ago. I mean, now, I think that also comes back to this thing about attention and listening to music. When you went out and you bought your album for £10 that you might have saved up, I mean, I don't want to sound like my granddad here, but those kind of things where you'd spent money, you listened to it and you enjoyed it and you sat down and immersed yourself in this piece of music. And I think the reason there's such a sort of flightiness with listening to music now is because there's not a perceived cost. It's also coming back into the structure of making music, when this whole thing of having to get to a chorus or having short intros because the attention span won't get people past that point is a sad. It's not an evolution really in music. I sat behind 3 girls on a flight back from the States when we were still flying, a year or so ago, and they had all the various music things you have access to on the plane and their headphones. And I was astonished. They at no point did they sit back in their chair and listen to, oh yeah, that's my album I'm listening to for the next 20 minutes on this flight. I think they got 15 seconds into a song was the max, and the whole flight was jump, 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 jump. And just as a process, that's an incredibly different way of listening to music, to wanting to put your headphones on, sit back and listen through to the journey of an album. And again, I don't want it to sound like some old bloke who's like harboring for the past, but I think you're genuinely missing out on the journey of a song and what songwriters can really give you if you go through the whole journey.
Does that change, Danton, when you're in the studio? I imagine that kind of changes how you think about the hook, how you think about you've got that 15 seconds to begin with to really draw this generation in. I imagine that affects your work, right?
Yeah, well, it does. It started to change it. Well, we're still in the days of CDs when record shops brought out listening posts where you could listen to a CD. And what they, like with all these things, your market researchers will look at the behavior of people listening and realize they put the CD on, listen to the first 3 songs, and then we're on to the next one. So instantly, the idea of structuring the album in the way you saw it as a journey of songs was out the window. The hits had to be the first 3 songs on the CD. So it became a very unbalanced piece of, musical content. And now it's this, especially when you see that kind of thing in reality, jumping between tracks, unless you're giving them a hook or a substantial kind of payoff within the song or within a pickup in beat, or early on, you're going to lose them. So the idea of a long, slowly meandering, developing intro, it's not going to happen. I mean, there are artists where that's not the actual direction. They're happy just to make songs in the way which they want that journey, and then it's up to that audience to follow it. But for your average sort of Radio 1 listener, I think now, it needs to happen quickly. Songs, I remember when they said songs had to come down to 4 minutes. That became the rule for radio. We're not playing over 4 minutes. And this was still in the days of tape, and so we had to make sure we recorded and said how long they were, the songs. Bear in mind, because this wasn't digital and you had to write that down on a piece of paper, we just write 4 minutes no matter how long the song was, because you knew no one was going to check it until it was already on the radio playing. Nowadays, that information is within the data which comes up so you know exactly how long it is. But that 4 minutes is a luxury now. I get told 3 minutes the whole time now with handing in stuff for radio. And I have a 3-minute edit. And it's like, I feel like I've hardly taken a breath before the song is over sometimes. It really hasn't had the chance to breathe and build and do what it wants to do. But
yeah, I mean, the days of writing Kashmir, as Led Zeppelin did, those days are gone. When it was like climaxing, and exploding at the very end.
Exactly. Or if you have a song that's anywhere near that length now, you read about it in the press. Amazing artist has a 6-minute song on Radio 2.
Then again, you stated it at the beginning of this conversation. I mean, there are bands who don't want to be signed on major record companies or who are signed on major record companies. And I was thinking of Tame Impala, for example. And Tame Impala, they have tracks that last 8 minutes, 9 minutes.
And they have a huge following. This goes back to something I was saying earlier, that if you're making music that the band's enjoying, you're enjoying, the people in the studio are enjoying, then that has to scale up outside in the real world. There will be people that like it. And I think because you're doing it and you're doing it for all the right reasons, you're just doing it to get it right and to enjoy it and to enjoy that piece of music, it will naturally have a follow-on, which is why I think it's a dangerous world when you try and fit, the cubes into the right spaces to fit a formula of structure, tempo, length of song, and sort of tick boxes for certain genres in order to fit a radio market or any particular market you're aiming for as such.
It's about 10 minutes. I wanted to talk about the cost of production and the funding of production. Having this amount of production today and having those amounts of young baby acts and first records, how does it get funded? Do you from time to time become a co-producer? Would that be a way of dealing with producers nowadays?
It doesn't. I don't think being the co-producer really helps with the cost of things. The way things are funded vary massively. It used to be obviously just labels we're talking about, but now there's private equity. There might be a private fund that has decided it wants to put some money into music and will find artists, or the artists will raise it themselves with various sort of Kickstarter or crowdfunding programs, or they just take out a loan. I remember this cropping up 20 years ago, thinking, well, what do I get for my record label? I get a loan basically of £100,000. But that loan for £100,000 is costing me a fortune in reality. And people started to think, actually, why don't I just get a loan from a bank for £100,000? Because the actual long-term payoff on that is significantly less.
Wow.
So it already started to move out. I mean, this is when we're talking about my average budget going back 20 years ago was about 150,000 for a record. Okay, that doesn't happen nowadays. I mean, there are pieces of gear in this room which cost more than most album budgets nowadays. It's completely messed up, So to make it work financially, you have to find various different ways of kind of raising the cash, spending it appropriately, where you're not cutting back on the actual production and creativity. I've had those conversations in the past where, okay, the budget is only this, maybe so you can just, if you just do this one a bit quicker. And it's like, well, I can't, because the way I produce is the way I produce. It's not something you do fast or slow. It's the way you work. And you can't like half EQ something. You can't half compress something. You can't, So the process it just means you get less for your time than we used to get. I think you have to understand that is the way now, and think of this as being, if you enjoy it as a career, you can hopefully make a fairly decent, comfortable living, but you're not going to make the kind of crazy money that people were making in the 80s.
True.
Until the middle of the 90s.
Sure.
Wouldn't it be tempting for you to set up your own label? I mean, you're confronted to so many. I mean, I guess you get demos every day. You're solicited every day.
Indeed.
Production projects.
And I have been through that process, and I now know why I don't do it. Production is all-encompassing for me, time-wise and effort-wise. As soon as you start taking on the board of like becoming the record company, then you kind of become the A&R guy by default.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's too many conflicts going on. You can set it up with a partner, as I did, but it's still in the long run it didn't work out as the best route forward financially. It was better for me to apply myself fully in a production mode. As I say, now because you tend to have a bit of the writing on songs, you can maybe start a bit of a publishing company, because over all these acts over the years, I have percentages on lots of different artists. So you can amalgamate that maybe as a production company. And also there are thousands of record companies, but in fact, all they are is someone like myself putting my artists out, and it's more of a kind of tax wrapper than anything else. Mm-hmm. And also it might not be the best route for the artist. They might, I don't want them to feel they're tied to that. I want them to do the production with me, but then find out what the best opportunity is for them to release it. It might be a big record company. If it's the right kind of act and it's going to hit the right kind of market. The machinations of the big labels, you kind of do need at some point. So even if you've got a very independent route up to a point, to do the big jump, if it starts to go off on a worldwide level, you do need to have those liaisons with the majors.
Okay, I mean, we're coming to the end of, it's been an hour, right? It went very quickly by.
Very quickly, I have to say.
I don't know, guys, if you have any questions, maybe Sherwin, who is a famous New York producer. Maybe Sherwin have a quick.
I'm just going to start before that, Didier. I'll jump in. Juliet had a question there. She put forth on the channel a little bit back. Juliet, do you want to unmute yourself and ask a question there to the audience? There you go.
Can you hear me? All right.
Yes.
Well, a couple of things. The first thing is, for me, if you're now producing in a way where people come in with very well prepared music, almost completely written, is it harder in a way to get in there and take it away from what I call the one-man syndrome, which is actually try and get the person to think outside of the box again and accept maybe a new vision? Because that would seem to be quite difficult.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because
they can only go so far. You can take them further, but are they able to accept it in that context?
Yes and no. It's that thing when people were giving me, when you would call it a demo rather than a kind of start of a track, I used to like very minimal demos. Piano and vocal, guitar, acoustic and vocal, because then all you hear is the song, and if that catches you, then you kind of know there's something there. Whereas very overproduced demos where it had like all the explosions, whistles and bangs on it, fully laden. It was like, well, you almost have to sift through that to see what the song is and make sure I'm not being actually lured by the production that's already there rather than the heart of it, which is the song. When we, often they want you to peel it right back. They're kind of bored of their own thing, or they can fall in love with it. And so then you have to kind of go in and dissect it and see what's working and what's not working. Often there's a reason they love it, and it is not just that kind of, they've done it themselves, they've become obsessed with it. But there are a lot of good reasons for keeping things. I keep a lot of things from demos nowadays, and a lot of songs I start from scratch. There's no clear divisor of how many I do of each. But I do like that, being able to sort of see the wood for the trees almost, of having a much more simple demo. The other thing is with demo in the old days where people put up a mic and they played it, is that you got an idea of performance skills, which is why pre-production is so important for me now. Because I hear a demo and it's amazing. Everyone's playing incredibly. So the reason I like to go into pre-production, which is i.e. just going into a rehearsal room, is that then you actually see the skills. You're not sitting there with a marker box out of 10, but you're just subtly watching people's ability. Because then in my head, I'm thinking, actually, okay, drums are going to be 3 days, not 1 day. Or the guitar, this guy's going to fly through the tracks. He's easy. All we need to do is think of the great ideas, and he can perform them. So you get that idea. Whereas with a heavily edited, heavily produced demo, I've really no idea of anybody's individual skill sets apart from the editor.
Very interesting.
But another question that came in there, Danton, while you were speaking, was from Anna. Anna, you want to unmute yourself and come in again?
Sure. I think, yeah, Didier already asked my question. It was about the genre and, like how much the speed of how music is produced and put it out there affects the style of music, the genres, and if it's narrowing it or diluting it. But
Absolutely. With regards to whether it's diluted or not, one thing we didn't mention about really is how with the tech that's come into this, it's changed the way we produce records and the way we record them. The tech has driven the genre as much as the genre has driven the tech. There's musical styles now which we only have because of the tech we have. They wouldn't have existed not because we didn't like the idea of them, but it's just because you couldn't have done them without, especially with if you look at a lot of modern pop, the processing is incredible, but they kind of feed back on each other. So working within that environment, a lot of those records can happen very quickly. I know some really successful pop records that have happened in a day, because it's programmed, you're editing, you're using incredible sounds from within your DAW. What you're not having to do there is do multiple takes with a guitarist, getting the nuances from each take, your favorite bits and pieces and compiling them, or just getting them to be able to play it. Because, there's often the case where people's, the parts they've formulated in their head as what they're doing are maybe a little ahead of their ability. So I've always quite liked that as a challenge to actually take the time and effort with somebody to get the part they want to hand over to the world through their performance. But that takes time. It's multiple takes, it's editing. So that takes significantly longer. Doing drum takes. Every record you've heard with a real drum kit on, the percentage which were one take from start to finish, I would say would be minimal, a fraction of the final things, because they've involved someone listening through to them, choosing the best bits, and putting it together. And that's something which is also a lot easier because of the technology. But so in answer to your question, certain genres would be a lot quicker to make a record than maybe a traditional band setup, where you're going through that process of takes and editing and performances and tweaking. So that also then dictates the budget. So ironically there, you get the part of the music business which is making the most money is probably one of the simplest parts to actually produce the music with regards to time. Synths, vocal, beats, programmed. Whereas the things which aren't really a big part of the money-making machine these days, with drum kits, bands, bass players, backing vocalists, singers, take a long time. I hadn't really thought about it like that, but you can see why that's a difficult world. And what is part of the charts also does oscillate. Bands come into favor, then disappear, and it becomes all electronic, and then bands come back. I think bands, although people keep saying to me this year, oh yeah, bands are coming back, they're being signed to labels. I don't really see it, to be honest. It's still very much a pop world out there.
Interesting. Sorry, Anna, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was just thinking about, you were also mentioning before about the playlist, and what you see in all these streaming services is that these playlists are like the title, or are based on the type of experience that you're looking for, like music for working, music for working out, music for traveling. So I was just wondering, like, if at least in the commercial music, will all these styles will be more aligned with the experience, like be aligned to be part of these playlists, yeah. And with experiences more than, let's say, like rock and like pop.
That's very interesting. The idea that it's the emotional experience rather than being genre specific, but it's more about how the song works for a mood or a place, an emotional experience. which I guess has already always been there, going back to mixtapes where you literally make up a cassette of your favorite records to fit, a party of a certain type, maybe. I still think that would be after the record. I think it would be unusual for an artist to have songs of very different elements, say acoustic, band, programmed keyboards, where the common thread is the emotion. I think that's always going to be a compilation thing afterwards, like a playlist, a compilation of different artists rather than an artist going for an emotion like that. I think that's very interesting, actually, how that's maybe more the driving force now on the commercial side, is that, because I heard that this morning. Weirdly, it was my eldest daughter was working out in part of the house, and the playlist was music to work out to. So I hear the phrase twice in the same day for the first time. But so I see what you mean. It doesn't have to be any particular type of music as long as it's upbeat and energetic.
Yeah, and also, because I've been listening to some artists, especially this guy from Spain, Tangana, and some other artists, in the Latin market, and also in the in the Anglo market, that their album that they released, each song seems so different from each other, like a completely different style. And I was wondering if that's also part of trying to fit each song in a different playlist, since people is not listening.
It might be part of it. I think it probably comes down to it was a different producer on each track, the way things are farmed out now. You might have the whole album being made in parallel now rather than in series like we used to. You might have the artist just going around to deliver vocals in 6 different studios with different producers on each one. So I think that's probably more to the reason. Quite often the reason I'm pulled in as a mixer rather than a producer is it's been done by a whole lot of different people, and they want to somehow give it some kind of common thread to make it sound like an album and not a compilation album.
That's the role of the mastering also.
Yeah, to a certain degree, the style of mastering, indeed.
Okay, Dubes, did you want to come in there?
Hey, how's everybody doing?
Hey, right.
Thanks a lot for taking the time to do this presentation, man. I just wanted to say that.
Thank you for coming.
Yeah, appreciate it. It was a pleasure. One thing that is going through my mind as you speak, just like as a producer myself, is, what role do you see session musicians playing moving forward? How has your experience been like recently? I mean, apart from the pandemic and all of that, with the developments in the industry, with royalty-free sound, do you see yourself still needing them as much? What kind of world is going to exist for them moving forward, I think is the right question.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. It's changed a lot over the years. And also it depends, because I work with bands a lot of the time, there wasn't the opportunity to use session players apart from string players. You have strings on the session, but that would be it, because it would be awful for if I have a band and I say I want to get a session guitarist in, that doesn't work because the guitarist is going to be completely put out of place. What does happen is with solo artists, I've done quite a few female solo artists and male solo artists over the last few years where it's her and then I have to kind of put a band together. So that will be session players. And over the years, you get to know quite a team of different session players. I have, depending on the song we're doing, I now have a kind of collective almost of people think, okay, they're going to be the right guitarist, that's going to be the right drummer. I have 2 or 3 drummers, 2 or 3 guitarists, bass players. And it's actually quite a privilege to be able to get them in nowadays, because there's often not the budget for starters. It's easy to get someone who's a really good synth player who plays it all and programs it up before and does it that way. So it's a much harder world for session players. The other thing that's changed is quite a few of them work remotely. When I was saying earlier about we go to a studio to do a particular drum sound or get to do the drums part, because the finances of that, the buildings don't exist anymore because they've all turned into apartments. But also quite a few of the main guys who would have been those session drummers have now set up recording spaces at their own homes.
Within their space, okay.
Yeah, and so you say to them, look, I need 5 passes in this kind of vibe, and then I'll edit them afterwards. A lot of people are working like that. I don't actually work like that. I still rather have them in the studio.
Okay.
It's easier for me to stand there and go, that bit's great. That way you went into the chorus, just take that little bit out and we can do it. So it's much more immediate. and responsive to them being here. So I still use session people. It's a much harder world. I think drummers got really hammered with the onset of all the various ways we can now program beats.
Facts, yeah.
Especially within the pop world where real drums don't play a big part anymore. And if they do, it's from a loop that we're all familiar with from some point in the past.
Okay.
But I still do the projects last year. I had session drummers. I tend to use the same person a lot these days.
That's understood. Yeah. I mean, it's that I find that with the, especially in my part of the world, which is like we're on the American side, Caribbean side, since a lot of bands are like out of work due to the fact that the cruise ship industry, the hotel industry is gone. I find that there are a lot of players out there that need to, I'm not going to say what they need to do, but may need to look into the opportunities that exist for them displaying their talents as session musicians. I've seen a few do them. I've seen a few people do loops, but it was just a question as to what your preference is as like an experienced producer.
Yeah, I mean, I end up working with both. Most of the time it's the band and they have their setup and identity as a band, but there will be players. But I am aware, actually, that makes more sense that the kind of touring bands aren't working. So there's, I have had more messages. I'm aware of that saying, hey,
Yes.
I'm free to do this and that. There's amazing players that, to think there's the kind of famous group of maybe session players that I might know through the industry here. But I find myself, I'll be in a bar or somewhere and seeing a band, because a lot of my work's been abroad in the last few years, and I'll see, a bar band, and you see something, think, oh my God, that's, he's the best drummer I've seen. That's the best. So these people, it's just the luck of the job. It's like there's a lot of amazing players out there where it's just it's a time and place thing. They're just
for everything, yeah.
And the really regular players, session guys, they have their chops down, not just in their playing, but in their social and interactive skills as well, with regards to getting out there and being in the right place for all the producers.
Gotcha. Thank you so much.
It is tough being a session guy now, I think, as a musician, really tough.
Can only imagine. Appreciate it.
Pleasure.
I think there's a question from somebody in the audience.
I think there's another Zerath. Would that be a relation?
This would be my son. This would be my son.
Julian,
would it really? I had no idea. I will investigate into that. Well, I had a quick question. Coming back to the A&R discussion you had earlier, and I was thinking on the playlist curators, the new A&R, or somewhat filling in their spot, seeing how playlists are becoming more and more important in the way music is consumed nowadays.
Sorry, Julian, could you say the start of that again?
I was thinking how the playlist curators on the streaming platforms are kind of becoming somewhat of the new A&R.
Absolutely.
Right? In the way they are the ones putting the spotlight on the music and the artists.
Absolutely. Nowadays, I was kind of thinking of that earlier, actually, it was like the A&R at the end of the system rather than at the beginning of the system. Because as you say, playlists are hugely important. And as is genre, actually, when we were saying earlier about, if you're a pop act, you'll get onto playlists where you can have, sorry, I'm slightly lost because I had this conversation today. I was trying to think if it was on here or with somebody else, but about the fact you can be a rock band and be on a playlist, but you're still only going to get a certain amount of streams compared to being a pop act on a playlist, which just by being in that genre will have a whole load more streams anyhow. And also we've also been aware of in the past how it was being abused in the same way a lot of areas in our industry were, where there was the whole tagging on of songs onto playlists, almost artificially created songs and artists, but being tagged onto playlists of very successful artists, because obviously it's a bit like in the old days where if you wrote the B side, you got the same money as the A side. By being tagged onto the right playlist, you're making the same money as that person at the top of the playlist, as long as the plays actually get through to you. So they are, it is a variation on A&R. Whether there's not really the same incentive to get paid, unfortunately, for those people as curators, but it definitely there are similarities to A&R there for sure.
Well, thank you for that answer.
It's a pleasure.
Any more questions?
I think you
Any more
were
questions?
concerned there's going to be a question on management there, where you, Didier, from Julian.
Well, no, not specifically. I mean, I guess you have. I mean, you're probably working more with managers than you used to do before. Then again, being based in London and the UK or the US, having a real artist management culture as opposed to France, for example, which we don't have one, makes.
We do, but in the same way that things have changed in many ways. I can't imagine working with a band which didn't have a manager maybe 10 years ago. That would never really happen. Whereas a lot of artists now we work with don't necessarily have management. They just have a particularly sort of motivated person within the band who gets the songs to our agencies or to me personally or to the studios.
It will be another conversation, but I think that we have to differentiate the manager and the management position. I mean, lots of young acts, they are managing themselves, right? I mean, it's what you define as a DIY in the US or artist as an entrepreneur in Europe. And the question is, at what point do I outsource the managerial function to a third party who is then called a manager? But management questions are being asked and have to be answered and have to be faced at some point.
Well, a professional manager will negotiate for you better than you're going to negotiate for yourself, that's for sure.
Of course.
And we'll have that back experience to know maybe the right people to be speaking to or the right people to be going to. They may well have a much better understanding of the world of producers than the band itself, and will hook you up with someone who's maybe more appropriate than someone you might have just found within your list of understanding. So, and also in the same way that I didn't go into having a record label, or I did, but the reason I no longer do that is that if you're doing well as a band, you're going to be too busy to do the management side as well. That's for sure. And
that's what I'm saying, is that at some point you're going to outsource it. Outsourcing comes with success, right?
Absolutely.
And being totally honest, I think it's even very good at the very beginning that a band is confront itself with market realities.
I'd just like to say that bands nowadays are so much more equipped in an understanding of markets and the industry and the process. But bands, again, I keep going back to a period, say more than 10 years ago, the manager did all that. The bands just got wasted and performed. That was their, objections, like party, wasting, performing, recording. Whereas now you speak to people and they have real business acumen. There was and this was fellow producers, maybe my kind of generation of producers, where the conversation of, when did we become the biggest partiers in the room? In the past, it was always trying to keep control of the crazy artist band. And nowadays, you feel like saying to them, come on, guys, just go out for a night, come on, shake it up a bit. Because they're like, no, we've got this amount of money, this amount of time. It's very business-like process to making music, which I admire. But there's also a lot to be said for some of the great records which we know from the past, which have come out of absolute chaos in the studio.
That's hilarious.
I've had the pleasure of being on some of these where I wish I'd written down what went on at the time, because it is a bit of a blur. But good things came out the end of it. So there's a mixed bag to all of these things. I think what's come across tonight with a lot of these questions is that and I like this. There's not necessarily a definitive answer to any of these things, and that's what makes it such a great business to be in. Is that there's opportunity for the way you interpret things in many aspects of it, and to say that one is right from everything from management, as we're saying here, or producing, or being the artist, or the genres, isn't what it's about. It's just about doing the bit you do as well as you can, I think, and taking it from there.
But again, I mean, to get back to the management issue, I think that it's a manager's job today to get the ball rolling for the bands he's working with. I mean, artist development now is in the hand of the manager. It's no longer in the hand of major record companies or the major independent labels.
Absolutely. But even if there wasn't a manager, we would ask for a legal representation anyhow for the artist, for their sake. They might agree with everything we're offering them. We'd still want them to run it past a lawyer. Just to say, look, it's all very well, we know we're presenting a good deal, but we want to make sure you understand that is a good deal, and that in the future it's not going to come up as any kind of question. So, with all things we do, there would be a lawyer involved at some point, whether that's organized by the manager or the band.
And if we are late in France in terms of artist management culture, we are catching up quite quickly. I've had conversation lately, you know, we can hope that the manager is going to be really a central figure in the music industry in the years to come. You know, that's for sure. Talking about this, I would like to go back, if you don't mind, if you still have a minute. You know, I've seen, you know, having your biog, you know, that you've worked with Trevor Horn, with Julian Mendelssohn, Steve Lillywhite, Steve Osborne Flood, whom I like, Paul Oakenfold. I mean, you've worked with lots of famous people. How was it? And there is one more specific person you have worked with whom I admire greatly, called Phil Spector. So you have, I mean, who passed away recently, and you know,
Yeah,
very figure. So I don't know if you have a few words about Phil Spector in particular, and working with all those great producers in the past.
I was very lucky as a freelance engineer for a decade to work with some really great producers, and it was just a constant learning experience. That's the way I see it. I mean, it was really hard work, and I was hopefully at the top of my game as an engineer at that time. But you watch the way everyone did things, and within everyone, and I'm sure, and within myself and the assistants who come through working for me as long-term assistants, they'll hopefully look at the things I do, which they perceive that I'm doing correctly or doing well, and they'll see which areas they think maybe I'm not. You know, you like to think you're getting it all right, but you know, I'm sure that's not the case. And I'd look at, you know, these people who are incredibly talented and successful, and think, okay, that's amazing, but that side of what you do isn't necessarily the way I would like to do it or think is the best way forward. So you learn a lot from them in those different ways. Some on a technical level, some on an interactive level, the way they just brought good things out of artists. That was a big thing for me. It's just seeing the people who just created an environment that was productive and creative. And those people varied on their technical skills. Some had no technical skills and some were very technical, but they created a great environment to work in. And that's always been at the forefront of what I try and do with production, is create an environment where people do their best. And so, but others were incredible musicians, others were incredible general thinkers, others were good technicians. So it was a real mixture of things. With regards to Mr. Spector, obviously, for anyone who doesn't know that whole era of Phil Spector, he was the pioneer of music production, really, pop production. But unfortunately, he finished his remaining years in jail due to a murder. I'm trying to think when it was, around 2010, 2006. I can't remember when it was. But I was actually working with him at the time, so it was quite a bizarre session, as you imagine. And he was a character, to say the least. He was a producer from a very different age. You know, I keep thinking now, every 5 years, we're talking about very different sort of epochs of production. But he was at the start of it, really, as the start of this person who was the producer, it wasn't just the A&R man and technicians, which basically it had been beforehand. Here's the A&R guy, these are your songs, here's the band, here's the guys in white coats adjusting meters in the studio to just basically capture your recording. He was of that generation of maybe Mickey Most in the UK in the 60s, Phil in the States. He started playing with the sounds more and, you know, creating this world of production, actually breaking the tools, saying, okay, this is the thing which is used to control your levels to the cutting lathe, but if we do this with it, it sounds like this. And suddenly realizing there's a whole world of exploration to come from abusing the gear. Most of the things which we have as effects nowadays are from making something do something it shouldn't. You know, that's kind of how they work. So yeah, I was lucky. They all brought different skill sets, and I worked with people who'd had success within different genres as well. So I could kind of, one of the things I missed about becoming a freelance producer when I was getting asked to do more production, and so much so that I didn't really have a chance to engineer, was the learning experience. You know, because although it's still a constant learning experience, which I think is also what keeps my interest up after all these years. You know, I'll have a junior in a studio and they'll be doing something and you say, what are you doing there? And I think because of the expected hierarchy, they'll be, oh, sorry, I was like, no, it's amazing. It sounds incredible. What are you doing? Tell me what you're doing. And when I actually look at what they're doing, it might be necessarily the best technical way of doing it, But that brings us back to a thing which I'll always say is the only important thing. This is someone who went to 15 years of engineering, but you realize is that you listen to something and you think that sounds great, or I really like it. And when you've thought that, the process getting to that point becomes irrelevant, whether you're a top-end world-class engineer or you happen to drop the mic in the right place. Because I think one of my kickstarts for that way of thinking was having been an obsessive engineer with my mic placements and everything. I still am to a degree. Coming from the studio into the control room and thinking, actually, that sounds great. Yeah, moving on. Going out afterwards and realizing the mic had fallen off the stand onto the floor the moment I left the room. And then thinking, why am I getting so caught up in the technicalities when, it's just how it sounds. And if there's a lot of mics up in a room, I'll often just go through them to see which one sounds interesting. And you think, oh, this sounds great. I'm doing a guitar, but it might turn out that it's the hi-hat mic on the drum kit. So it's that kind of freedom of just trying things out and seeing, and also they're the way you make the most interesting sounds, But there's no rules. And I love the fact that I've still learned the whole time from people that come into a room, no matter what their experience. There's something to be learned.
So there's still plenty of room for innovation. Yeah,
well, I think that's the reason I'm still as excited coming to work now after 35 years as I was at the start. I genuinely enjoy my days at work. It's not like I sit there time watching. It's normally like, oh my God, how did it get to midnight? When the minute you started fiddling with something at 3 in the afternoon, and you turn around and think, where does it go when you're in that world of thinking about music?
Niall, a word maybe?
I think that's a great way to finish up there. No, we're an hour just on point. Danton, that was fantastic. Thank you so much for really appreciate your openness in that. That was awesome.
Apologies for the technical malfunctions at the beginning.
No problem. Just to let everyone know, it's recorded, and I know Didier would like to use this as well on his platforms, but this will go up on the platform either this evening or tomorrow if anyone wants to kind of go over all these nuggets of information. But yeah, unless anybody has any kind of last questions you want to get out there, I think that was an awesome session. 1 hour on the dot. Any more questions?
I'm sure if any questions pop to mind after the event, I'm more than happy for Didier to pass on an email if someone wants to fire me a question.
I most certainly will.
Yeah. Okay, with that then, Didier, thanks so much.
Well, thank you Niall, for having us.
That was amazing. Really enjoyed that.
Thank you very much.
Appreciate it. Really appreciate it. Thanks, everyone.
Cheers.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Danton.
Be in touch.
And, talk to you soon. Talk to you guys soon.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.